welcome to The Human Edge. This week's guest is Mark Peters. Mark is Professor of Paediatric Intensive Care at Great Ormond Street Hospital here in London. Imagine taking a group of children up Mount Everest, measuring the oxygen quantity in their blood, and that 10 years later leading to a groundbreaking study which could potentially improve patient care for kids and save the NHS millions of pounds. What an amazing story. So you can hear all about that and lots of other great stuff in this episode. If you find it as interesting as I did, please like, share, subscribe. That would be massively helpful. Thank you. Mark, thanks for coming in today.
No problem.
I wanted to begin by talking about the NHS, and we're going to be talking about the NHS generally because that's where you work. But I suppose the context for me is fairly recently I had on the podcast Jeremy Crane, who's a consultant surgeon, and he had some views about the NHS in terms of funding and resource that were interesting to me because the received wisdom is that the NHS is underfunded and under-resourced and struggling as a result. What do you see from where you are?
Well, go straight in. So it all depends on how you measure things, okay? I mean, if you were to think about international comparisons, for sure we spend less on healthcare here than pretty much every other Western European and North American country. But we have some things that many of those services don't have, including the equity of access, the free at the point of contact stuff, which many of our colleagues would not understand, would not recognise, our North American colleagues in particular. So we've got lots of things to be proud of. And the other part of this equation that often gets forgotten, I mean, everybody likes to tell you the story that things are difficult, and they are, and people are pissed off, and people feel they're working hard. But the other part of the story is that for nearly every healthcare outcome, things are better now than they have ever been. So the system is definitely creaking, and it's working flat out, and it's burning people in the process, but it is delivering some incredible outcomes for very little resource. So you can answer the question from lots of different angles, if you like. Would it be better if there was more money in the system? Of course it would. There are huge inefficiencies in the system that we can see daily, but it is still coping in the majority. Well, I should qualify the answer that I work in a setting in Great Ormond Street on the intensive care unit that is really very well resourced, and that's from a combination of the intensity of work we do, which carries a lot of money with it, but also there's international demand for that service, and there's charity support for the hospital. So we're perhaps in a funding bubble that many of our colleagues aren't, and so I don't want to dismiss their concerns. It's real, and it would be better with more money. It would be more efficient if the money is spent wisely, but we should still be really proud of it. I still think it's an incredible service that most of our colleagues around the world would get nowhere near. The US healthcare system is many times more expensive and many times less effective.
Yeah. So your work is paediatric intensive care. Has it always been?
Since '92, it's been paediatric intensive care. I trained in Bristol and did some adult medicine after I qualified, and that was very different in those days. The day after I finished house jobs, so 1 year after qualification, I was the most senior person in the hospital at night.
Wow.
And you learn very quickly, and you spend a long time there, and I enjoyed that, but I quickly realised that most of the specialities that were going to be adult hospital medicine didn't really appeal to me. And what rather appealed was the sort of sense of being a generalist, being able to deal with almost anything that came through the door.
Yeah.
And paediatrics offered that. And once you're into paediatrics, then the place where you do the most extreme form, and that was intensive care. So that became a sort of logical step for me. And as soon as I walked onto an intensive care unit, I felt at home. I'm clearly, I recognise I have some personality traits that suit that environment. I like data, I like graphical displays, I like the objectivity that comes with lots of information. And I am less sensitive than some people to the emotional burden of that kind of setting. Some people would say I'm on the spectrum, but hey, you know, there are degrees of personality that mean I don't think I feel the pressure of what's at stake as much as some people, but I very much like the sort of data-rich environment, and that combination has suited me for nearly 30 years now.
And I'm imagining there's something about the fast-paced nature of working in intensive care as well.
Yeah, I mean, we can play that a little bit. Intensive care has changed a lot. It used to be lots of well children getting sick with vaccine-preventable diseases, or things that have subsequently become preventable through vaccines. So meningococcal disease, pneumococcal disease, so awful causes of infection or meningitis. And they've almost disappeared. We used to see 50 to 100 of those a year. We might see 2 now, and that's purely vaccine-based. So the population now is often children who have got complex chronic health needs, who've had a series of seizures or a new pneumonia or so on. So it's a slightly slower pace, but with a very fragile population.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you, you've kind of already, I don't know, bypassed or sidestepped, but I was thinking that working in a paediatric intensive care unit must be challenging, kind of emotionally, and whether or not you're maybe a little bit inured to it, but I'm sure you see that with your colleagues.
Oh, for sure, and we know that there's an attrition more on the nursing staff than the medical staff, because the nursing staff are by the bedside with the family members continuously for a 12-hour shift multiple times a week. And that's a different interaction than arriving, making an assessment, having a conversation, making a plan and leaving again.
Yeah.
So and we did some work a few years ago with one of the psychologists from St George's Hospital about the personality traits that were associated with post-traumatic stress from working on an intensive care. And it's interesting, it's not straightforward, and like everything in biology, there are different successful strategies. And rather against the sort of prevailing narrative, one of the successful strategies is a little bit of depersonalization, is to treat it as a problem to solve. And I think that's my approach. I think the bit that I can do that maybe the next person can't do is use 30 years of experience and an understanding of the patterns that occur, and not be distracted too much by how horrible the whole thing could be if you let yourself think about that.
Yes. Yeah.
Because there are plenty of people who are very skilled at the emotional intelligence thing that I'm perhaps not. My wife would be very amused to hear me admit that, but there you go. So do you see what I mean? So in the sort of jigsaw of the professional team, I think I have a particular role, which is analyse risk and benefit of the next actions.
Yeah.
And if you're clear about that, clearly it's manageable because I've done it for a long time.
Yeah.
But not everyone can. And actually sometimes what happens is that people who have been very high functioning suddenly come across something that breaks through their professional resilience, or and then it's not always clear why. Sometimes it's the outcome, sometimes it's the process that my defence is often, look, all you can do is concentrate on the process. All you can do is do everything right and make sure you've checked that what you're doing is generating the response you want. The outcome will be the outcome. You haven't got full control. You can have partial control of that. But sometimes people find the outcome so distressing that it doesn't matter if the process has been perfect. And there's a little bit of a societal narrative that a bad outcome equates to a bad process, and that's not always true.
Yes, I think that's true, and I see that from the work I do and the conversations I've had with, for example, in the business world with entrepreneurs. We are very attached to the outcome that we want, but we can't control that.
Yeah.
As you say, all we can control is what we're doing. We control the process. The outcome is what the outcome is.
And then part of the problem with that is that when you review cases that have gone badly, as we always do, you've got to remember you're looking at it in reverse, the prosecutor's fallacy. We're only discussing this because it went wrong.
Yes.
And so to reconstruct the decision at the time is quite a complex and effectively artificial to do so.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's the sort of. I think everybody copes slightly differently. You do see signs of stress in your colleagues, but there used to be a team of 5 consultants who you'd be on call, every week in some form. Now we're into double figures, and so everything's diluted a little bit, and people pursue other areas of interest, which helps sort of balance the working life.
Yeah, I'm wondering from a recruitment perspective, coming back to what you were saying before about the study you did and the kind of psychology around that. When you were in the process of building out the team, did you look for different psychological profiles?
The NHS has no sophistication in doing that sort of thing. I mean, there aren't tens of people with the training and the expertise available to choose for these jobs. There may be 1 or 2, and I think that's probably beyond what we can do and still staff the service. And again, we're lucky because we're in the big hospital with a reputation and charity money and so on. So people do want to work there. If you're in a department that has none of those features, it may well be even more of a struggle to get a full team of consultant staff, for example.
What kind of psychological support, again, if any, does the NHS provide?
Yeah, we do have ward-based clinical psychologists who are primarily there for families and patients, but offer regular staff support. It's variable how engaged the medical staff are, but it's definitely there.
And for you, what does your support system look like?
But my support system is having a busy and active life and doing things that I love doing. So interestingly, I was thinking about this on the way up here. Actually, most of the things I spend my non-working time doing are sport, but they're things I'm mostly rubbish at. So I play football on a Tuesday night with a bunch of dads from the local school. I'm comfortably the worst player on the pitch. But
you love it.
But I love it, and I love it because it's one of those unsolved problems. I played cricket for my local club for 30 years. I've still never got 100. And I'm in the 4th team now. And but the satisfaction is in the challenge. If you could do this, I'm not sure I would get anything from it.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
At work, I feel I can do it most of the time without having to think too hard because you recognise patterns very quickly. Yeah. And so I like that sort of deliberate practice thing. Real effort to compete or and exercise is part of that. There's no doubt if you're in the moment playing a game or riding my bike or running or any of those things, the way you think changes. So that's mostly how I manage any stress. And occasionally the pub, that's also featured from time to time. I think it's just having a variety of friends, many of whom are non-medical, and most of them aren't the slightest bit interested in my story about what happened last night on call, but
Yeah, there's something grounding about that, isn't it?
absolutely.
It's like having young children again, or just children generally who don't really care too much about what Dad does.
Not the slightest bit interested. Dad, why were you banging around last night? Well, I was going back into work at 3 in the morning. What was it? Not the slightest bit interested.
Yeah. So you said that football and cricket are like problems to be solved, and that energizes you. That you love that. What are the problems to be solved in a work context that's still like?
Great question. So I didn't set this up. so I've done the clinical work for many years, but from about 2008, I took a detour into academic life. And I'd done a PhD during my training, but this was sort of formally being a university employee. And since then, I started off doing some laboratory-based immunology stuff, but I got a bit frustrated that while that was detailed and you could get to answers about this tiny little question about this molecule and this molecule talking to each other, that was quite a long way from having any impact on patient care. And eventually I worked my way around to using some of that scientific way of thinking into doing what we call pragmatic clinical trials. By that we mean you're sort of replicating the clinical question that the staff are left at the bedside trying to answer, and formalising it into a trial structure. And that's what I spent the last 10 or 15 years doing, and we've been lucky enough to be incredibly well funded. In fact, I've just yesterday had confirmation for the sort of next year, 5 years worth of funding, a massive grant from government to run a whole series of these sort of trials nationally. And the really interesting ones are something that's fundamental, that challenges a little bit of dogma about what we do. Okay, for example, we probably take it for granted that oxygen is good. Certainly, we've got watches, not my watch on today, but which can measure your oxygen saturation. And we're all learnt that high is good. Okay? It turns out there are reasons why that might well not be the case. And having made that argument, we did a trial over several years, 2,000 children on ventilators around the country, comparing a lower oxygen target, so 88 to 92%, so just a little bit lower, like you'd be on an aircraft perhaps, or up a mountain, versus the standard care, which was to run the oxygen very high. And it turns out that there's a significant advantage to being in the lower oxygen. Okay, just a little bit, it's a small effect, a few percent effect, but a nudge towards getting better quicker and a nudge towards surviving more frequently. And that's interesting for two reasons. One, it can save money and make more people survive. That's clearly the headline. But also, it tells you something about we've misunderstood the biology.
Yes.
Or have an incomplete understanding of the biology. And that's the excitement of doing this sort of work. Is wow, that's incontrovertible. That is true.
Yes.
Subject to the constraints of the particular experiment we did, but it's quite a big and messy experiment, so it's probably a robust result. And that's really exciting. But my excitement is not just specific, if I can infuse you with it, it's not just specific to this oxygen question, which is, that is central to the way intensive care is done, but it's challenging the routine way of thinking.
Yes.
It's really exciting.
Yeah. So there are kind of two questions I have, and I want to ask both at the same time. So obviously can't do that. But when you were putting, this is the Oxy-PICU. Yeah. So when you were putting that together, was it controversial in any way? Was there kind of a risk associated with, in my terminology, giving kids less oxygen than the norm?
So you have to make a case that this is a reasonable thing to do, and you have to provide pilot data or indicative data that this is widely. In fact, we had the perfect setup for that trial in that a number of guidelines said actually you probably should go a bit lower, even though they had no evidence to base that on, just on a sort of inquiring best practice approach from experts. And there's a general principle that doing less to patients is best if you can get away with it.
Yes.
And then we had the evidence also that current practice was at the other end of the extreme, was very high. So you have recommendations here, current practice here. It's fair enough to do them in a trial. There was a lot of pushback. Interestingly, there were lots of people who said you can't do that; you'll hurt kids' brains.
Yes.
And some centres didn't participate, but 15 out of the 20 we asked did. And the same people who said you can't do that, it's dangerous, are now the enthusiastic conductors of the thing. And it's just, you just quietly bite your tongue and note, just be pleased that you've put a little brick in the wall of evidence that maybe nudges people in the right direction.
Yeah. What did you? So I'm imagining this was quite a big kind of logistical coordination.
Yeah, I mean, it's a 10-year project, effectively.
A 10-year project. Okay. Wow.
From having, well, it's quite a long story, but the original, I was lucky enough to be involved in a group that went to Everest.
Wow.
And in fact, we took some of the kids from the school and showed that they, going up to base camp, well, not all the way to base camp, Namche Bazaar, 3,500 metres. The rest of the adult group went up to base camp.
Yeah.
And doing some physiological testing and showing that it was within acceptable safety limits. And
and sorry to interrupt, because I'm super interested about this. So you have enthused me. The kids that you took with you, were they well kids? Were they?
Yeah, they were well.
Okay.
I think that's.
Yeah.
It would be a challenge. You start with the lowest risk environment, but the group had been 5 years before with a slightly different profile. So the project I'm talking about was investigating if lowlanders, people who'd grown up at sea level or near, had a different response to altitude to Sherpas who are intergenerationally adapted to hyperbaric hypoxia, low pressure, low oxygen.
Yeah, and by the way, I've had altitude sickness before, so I'm not that I have a vested interest, but I get what the effects of lower oxygen can.
Yeah, so there is definitely a genetic contribution to that.
Yeah.
The project was successful. They could show some of the adaptation that Sherpas have that allow them to do these incredible things at altitude. But actually, perhaps the most interesting observation was from the previous trip 5 years before, when a handful of the investigators went to the top. They went to the top and then came a few hundred metres off the top because it was windy, dropped their trousers, took a femoral arterial blood gas.
As you do when you're up on Everest.
And one of the Sherpas ran down 2 vertical kilometres to where they had a laboratory.
Wow.
Okay? Camp 4, I think it was. And they ran the blood gas analysis.
Yeah.
And so blood gas is a measure of the oxygen dissolved in the blood, amongst other things. But the headline result was that the oxygen pressure in the blood was at a level, so this was them breathing atmospheric air at this point, not breathing oxygen at 8,400 metres, was at a level that only 20 years ago we would probably have said was lethal on a single observation.
Yeah.
Okay, and they were not dying; they were having a sort of life-changing experience on the top of the world.
Yeah.
Okay, the headline being that we have overestimated the harm of low oxygen and underestimated our capacity to adapt. And so that sort of lit the fuse, if you like, for a whole series of studies showing that actually oxygen may follow a much more complicated risk-benefit curve. So very low is probably bad, very high is also bad. And then it just becomes a question of comparing on this U-shaped curve where the optimal risk is. You're trying to find the lowest risk.
Yes.
And then there's all sorts of compromises you have to go through in the design of a trial to, well, what can I get away with? What will my colleagues and patients and families accept in this comparison? And you need them to be far enough apart that there's a chance of seeing a signal, but not so far apart that you might miss an important intermediary value. And that's all the sort of judgment that takes, because you only get funding once for this sort of thing, because then it becomes a whole question of how many patients it's realistic to subject to this kind of study and the cost associated with that. And so the So there's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
And we were lucky enough to get most of those calls right and see a positive signal in comparison. But I'm not underestimating the role of luck in that, because we could have chosen values that were so close together there was no difference.
Yes.
We could have chosen values that were so far apart that we had crept up the arms of the U-shaped curve, if you like, to the equivalent.
One of the things you and I talked about when we first spoke was what success looks like in this context and kind of generally in the work you do. How do you think about that?
Yeah, interesting. You did mention that, and I hadn't really thought about it again. So, I mean, clearly success means, well, the university counts success as writing papers, getting grant money, changing practice, those sort of things. And so I recognise all of those.
Yes.
Personally, I love the moment when the experiment's all finished and you count it all up and see whether there's an answer in this. That's very rewarding.
Yeah.
Whatever
the answer. Whatever the answer. Okay.
Although being human is much nicer that it's a positive result. But actually, if you set that up right, you have learned something that no one has ever seen before when you've done that. And I think that's really exciting.
Yeah.
And the other thing that's success is the process of encouraging other people to think in that way and ideally do it for themselves. There's a couple of times when consultants in other specialties have asked me, listen, I've got this idea, how would I put this into a trial structure? I said, well, I think I would do it like this, and then go back, and then this sort of iterative approach. And a couple of those have gone through to be trials that have had results and change practice, and that's really satisfying.
Yeah, I can imagine that's rewarding. And one of the questions I was going to ask you earlier about this kind of huge 10-year project and an enormous kind of logistical operational exercise. One of the things you were trying to do is bring people along the journey with you. How did you go about doing that?
Yeah, so I take no... Well, I was going to say I take no credit for that. That's probably not quite... But, I mean, we're lucky enough to have a group. So we've got a perfect mix in UK Paediatric Intensive Care. There are quite a few departments, but there's not so many that it's impossible to keep up. So we know most of the departments, and there's 30 in the country. Okay, and that's a size that works quite well to sort of have an annual meeting where we can all discuss what's coming up as a research project, and you get a reasonable feel of the enthusiasm for it or otherwise. Okay, so that's the first thing. The other thing is we work with incredibly professional clinical trials unit. There's a group called ICNARC, who started off as an adult intensive care audit service, but are just so organised and professional. A lot of the operational stuff they just do.
Yeah.
So my colleague's job is to come up with the idea, clean it up into a form that can be a head-to-head comparison between the two arms, and then jointly with the trials unit we'll put together a project. And then my job is just to keep it infused. This is, I mean, at the time we finished the Oxy trial, it is the largest trial that's been conducted in the world in critically ill children with that kind of structure, randomised control, individual patient consent thing. Methodological details that won't be of interest to you all, but for us that matters because it gives you confidence in the answer, and it shows that. So two things: it gives you confidence in the answer, but it shows that something on this scale can be done. Okay, and so it means our next applications have been double that size. On the one we've just been funded for is effectively 3 or 4 times that size, and so that's a massive undertaking. But the group we work with is confident it can do it because we've shown we can do it.
Yeah. Is this the same kind of trial on just on a bigger
Similar
basis?
things. So, I mean, we're basically picking off lots of the practices that are used. When do you transfuse? How much intravenous fluid should you give? What sedative drugs should you use? Some of the day-to-day decisions that are used in every child, with limited evidence or indirect evidence from adult practice, we're going to try and work out. And the great thing is, if you put 12,000 patients into a trial, you can start to see effects that are, fractions of percents difference. And although that will make a very little difference for an individual child, over a population, the whole system becomes a bit more efficient, a bit better in terms of outcomes, and that's something that would, and then even potentially it can become a sort of almost a self-learning process. The next thing gets plugged into the system, and we continue to learn. The fact you started off asking about the NHS and its state, the NHS has done a remarkable job of learning to improve processes, often in the absence of evidence, just by professionals' expertise and guidelines and aligning processes and standardisation. That's great, but it will eventually come up against or can eventually come up against a block if the thing you've chosen in your guideline is not the best option. And the only way of choosing the best option is head-to-head trial comparison. I just find it very exciting. It's the thing that makes me... I can go to work and do a ward round on the intensive care unit, and I've done that so many thousands of times. I can do it. I don't get quite the same excitement as I would writing a grant or so on to generate new knowledge.
Yeah. One of the things I'm very curious about is what good leadership looks like. Again, in your part of the NHS, whether that be from a kind of clinical perspective or a research perspective. Let me continue the question whilst you're thinking about it by asking, when you're working with junior doctors or junior kind of research fellows, I don't know if that's the right word. What learnings do you try and kind of impart to them?
Okay, so the last bit of the question is probably easier than the general case. I mean, and in fact, I'm between teaching sessions doing this. So,
yes.
So what I'm always interested in is teaching or helping a resident doctor think in a particular way, rather than telling them what to think.
Yes.
Okay, and that's my scientific flavour, is that I want you to doubt everything and know where you look. That might be your experience you look at, it might be the literature you look at. So that and people often have one of two responses when you try and teach like that. One is to sit up and say, "Really? Do we not know that? How do?" And that's intriguing and exciting because their potential for lifelong learning is sort of demonstrated in front of you. The response I value less is someone sort of glazing over and just wanting to be told what's the best option.
Yes.
We have a huge international set of trainees, and some have come from an environment where they is very hierarchical.
Yes.
And what they do is what the senior guy says.
Yeah.
And so it can be a little bit discombobulating when the senior guy says, "What I want you to do is doubt everything and work out for yourself what to do." But you're hoping that might balance. There's very little that we know for certain. So
I'm just pausing there. I hadn't envisaged that kind of cultural challenge.
Yeah, it could be quite an issue actually.
Yeah.
And we just have to be aware of that, and hopefully demonstrate that there's value in challenge and recognising uncertainty. So this is actually something I think the skill that you want to teach a junior member of staff is the ability to make a decision in the face of uncertainty. Okay, because in medicine it's always uncertain.
Yeah.
Okay, and the worst position to be in is an inability to make a decision. The decision might be to do nothing. That's fine, as long as it's a considered balance of risks and benefits as you understand them at the time.
Yeah.
That's fine. But being sort of overwhelmed by the lack of information and always waiting for the next result may not be the right thing to do.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking, so on the one hand, the imperative to make a decision, and on the other hand, well, if I make a decision and it goes wrong, somebody could die.
Yeah.
That's such a tough balance to achieve.
Yeah, and I don't think I have a good way of... I mean, this is going to seem trivial, but if you're faced with a physiological problem, okay, There's often a choice between more or less of something. And it is not unreasonable, in the absence of evidence, to do whichever one you prefer. If it doesn't go right, do the opposite. Okay, I mean, you've got a system that is in a complex system that's in a state that you don't want. You try and disturb that system. There's always a bit of uncertainty about what the response is going to be. It's a non-linear system. It can do anything. You've got some physiological knowledge that's based on dogs dissected in the 1920s that does not mirror the picture that's in front of you. Okay, and so you may make an action and then retract that, and you can go there. You might speed the heart rate up or slow the heart rate down, for example. But what's required is that you recognise the uncertainty you're dealing with, and don't just make the decision and walk away. You wait and you see what happened. Interesting.
Yes. You were saying earlier about, emotional regulation and the importance of that, and some colleagues are kind of more emotional than you. When you're working with people like that, so they're kind of effectively reporting to you, you're the guy they look up to. From your own perspective as a leader, how do you lead people who maybe are more emotional than you are?
Okay, that's a good question, and I'm just thinking about people listening to my answer and other words. So the most extreme form
don't
of that,
second guess.
most extreme form of that is one of my jobs is in something called the Children's Acute Transport Service. So this is our retrieval service based at Great Ormond Street, where a local hospital with a child who's becoming critically ill will ring up and say, "Can you send a team to help stabilise and bring in to intensive care?" I've done that since it was set up in 2001. I still do nights on call for it, and it's not infrequent you get a call. So the senior people on the site might be helping to resuscitate the child, and they ask a relatively junior person to go and make the call. And so at 3 a.m, they'll come straight through to me because the teams are out, and you can hear in the voice the tension. Sometimes you can hear the arrest buzzer go off in the background. You can hear carnage, okay?
Yeah.
And you can hear the pitch of their voice, and you can tell they're not listening to you because they're just dumping the information and hopefully the plot. And how you respond varies. I have said, "Stop talking, I'm going to tell you what to do," which nobody said, "Don't be rude, they're scared," or something like that. But actually,
that's what they need to hear. That's what you think they need to hear in the moment.
That's my guess. And I know you can be wrong because you don't know anything about their background, or you may have only limited details of the situation. But my view, as I think we started with, is the value I've got in that conversation. I've seen this before, very likely, or something very similar to it. And so I can probably tell you the top 2 or 3 things to do. And actually, I don't need very much information to give the first approximation of that. So how do I handle people who are being emotional? I try and give clear, calm instructions. I cannot remember shouting at work at any point. I tend to get quieter and slower because I think people listen a little bit more. And the more tense it gets, the bigger the team always gets as people come to help. A sort of economy of words. Everybody stop, listen for a second. These are the next 3 things we're going to do. People are usually very responsive to that. Because for 2 reasons. One, it's great, we know what the plan is, but it's also taking some responsibility for it. And so, whatever. But it should be clear, and if there's time, I will say, because I think this is what's happening. So that we haven't just got a plan, we've got a rationale as well. And if that gives somebody an opportunity who's seen the situation differently to say, but I don't think that's what's going on. And so, I really value when a more junior member of staff is able to stand up and say, I don't think we should do that because.
Yes.
Okay, and that does happen. I mean,
but that only happens whether it's in a hospital or in a business context, when the leader in question, you in this instance, has created an environment which people feel safe to be able to express their opinions.
And again, we mentioned sort of cultural hierarchy. You're not, if you walked into that situation, you often don't know what people's previous experiences and the threshold at which they would speak up.
Yeah.
Ideally, you would ask a couple of the people directly, are you happy with that? Do you think that's going to,
Yes.
You don't always have time for that sort of thing. But, most of this isn't very complicated, actually. The priorities are relatively clear-cut in most situations. Right? There is often a lot of noise, but everybody breathes through the same tube. Everybody's heart is the centre of the circulation.
Yes.
You need a bit of blood pressure, you need a bit of oxygen, and you need some red cells to carry it around. It's relatively simple. So I will not overplay that we're sort of solving this incredibly complicated problem.
Yeah.
It's mostly just an organisational problem about what are we going to do first and how are we going to do it.
As you're talking about it's a common problem. Yes, it is, but it's a common problem trying to be solved by a collection of human beings with their own, their own personalities, their own. That's, I think, the complicating factor. Throwing human beings in the mix, and which is interesting for me. Just thinking about kind of this podcast, one of the things that I'm trying to kind of show to the audience is, no matter how successful my guests are, they're human beings just like you and me, with the exactly the same kind of stuff going on. We shouldn't put people on a pedestal just because they're successful.
Oh no, the only reason I'm successful, whatever that means, is a series of fortunate events. It's not any substantial difference in what I do. Right place, right time.
Yeah.
And not making bad decisions often enough to disappoint people. That's how I see it.
And that's interesting in itself. So you're being modest. So we'll put that to one side. I think we can all agree that there's an element of luck in every successful person's journey. The luck of birth, for starters. But then there's something about being able to make kind of clear-sighted decisions often, and that's important. There's a skill in that, I think.
I think so. A few years ago, 2004, I had to be unit manager. I really didn't like it, but I did do a bunch of personality testing, and
do you mean for yourself or
for myself?
Yeah. Okay.
Why I didn't like it is another whole conversation.
That's podcast part 2.
It's quite a difficult thing managing in the NHS, but because you can't pull strings very easily. Anyway, but I was quite an extreme outlier on one domain of one of the tests, was that I didn't care what people thought of me. Which I think links a little bit to the depersonalisation way of solving the stress of it. I really don't think I do, actually. And I think that's helpful in science, because science is systematised failure. You try one thing and you refute the hypothesis, and then you move on. But it's full of rejection letters or reviewers' comments that you don't like. That's kind of the process. Yeah. And I'm okay with that.
Okay.
And I think that not caring too much what people say allows you to be reasonably robust in sort of career decisions. Yeah. It does carry the risk that you don't listen to what someone says, but I'm not sure that's the same thing. The way I've chosen to interpret that finding is that I don't think you have huge influence over me by not liking this. Okay, that's fine. So I just thought I hadn't thought about that for a while. But
and where do you think that comes from? So I'm interpreting it as as being...
Some people call it confidence, some people call it arrogance. I'm hoping it's not quite that.
There's something about being, it's a confidence for sure, but being really comfortable in your own skin so that criticism, you don't take criticism personally.
Yeah, I think that's a better phrased version of what I was trying to say. And I'm not sure why, because I wasn't a particularly confident kid. I had this great idea. I wanted to be a super sportsman. I never was. I'm still rubbish at football and cricket, but as I am now. But I've always been good enough at whatever I was doing to get into the next step. Okay, I've never been a perfectionist, but I've been. So the whole thing in clinical trials about you try and do the perfect trial, you'll fail, but you just need to be good enough to generate the evidence that can change practice. So that good versus perfect sort of curve.
Yes.
So I've always been comfortable with just being good enough. Yeah, okay. And then the next opportunity is there. And I work with people who are perfectionists, and it costs them, I think, because it's very difficult to control the kind of environment we work in.
Yeah, and I think, I don't know, I think there's a correlation between a lack of confidence and perfectionism. But also there's a misunderstanding, I think, that a lot of people think that confidence you're born confident, and I don't think that's true either. So I grew up being the opposite of confident, very shy, very awkward.
And you're doing this,
and yet I'm doing that. And so confidence, I think, is a byproduct of other things.
Yeah,
it's a byproduct of lots of different things, and maybe that's a podcast for another day as well. But this podcast is called The Human Edge for a reason. Okay, so what is, and this could be the last question because I tend to like this question last. What's your edge? What are the things that take you out of your comfort zone?
Out of my comfort zone. If I was ever asked to sing, that would be a complete disaster. I'm not sure, actually. I mean, maybe I've just constructed a combination of jobs and roles that are within my comfort zone. I'm not very good at tolerating positions for which I don't understand the rationale. Okay, so I need to understand why somebody's thinking something.
Yeah.
And if I perceive that's irrational, I struggle with that.
Okay. And how does that show? How do you show up in that?
I may roll my eyes, or verbally roll my eyes, and that can come from all sorts of. But if someone has a purely emotional response to something we've said, I remember a family once saying, "Doctor, you've got a black aura."
Wow.
I hadn't have a clue how to respond to this. I was saying the facts as I saw them.
Yeah.
That didn't match their view of what was happening. And suddenly we were in this completely different sort of spiritual place for which I've got no equipment to deal with the conversation.
Yeah.
It can be when religion comes into decisions about what we should be doing. I find that impossible to argue against because it's irrational in the strict sense of that word. So I'm I'm quite fact-based, and so if we're in a situation where people are making stuff up, sort of post-truth world, I find that very difficult.
Yeah, let's hope the post-truth world that exists mainly on the other side of the pond doesn't. I bet, are you seeing that more and more in this country?
I think so. I think it happens, but I'm a huge believer in the whole Steven Pinker thing. The Enlightenment has changed everything, and it continues to do so. That the progress through science in particular, but rational thinking, is such a force for good that actually, if you were asked when would you like to be alive, the answer is always now, because everything is better.
Yeah.
And whether that's inequality, whether that's health, wealth, all sorts of things. Yeah, I'm a little bit sceptical of people who say, "Oh, it's just awful because." Well, maybe, but just remember where you were 15 years ago, 30 years ago.
Yeah. And that's a beautifully optimistic note to end the conversation on. Everything is better now. I don't want to say any more than that. Mark, thanks so much for coming in.
No problem.
Great conversation. Thank you.